Let's dive right into this explainer and look at how one single chaotic afternoon at a 1980 football match permanently rewired Scottish law and culture. We're going to see exactly what happens when sports, deep societal divides, and strict legislation all violently collide. It's an absolute textbook case of cause and effect, and honestly, we're still feeling the shockwaves of it today.
On May 10th, 1980, the sun was just beating down on Hampden Park. It was a gorgeous day, the kind that makes a grand, massive stadium feel more like a Mediterranean holiday than a typical Scottish afternoon. But man, by the time the final whistle blew, that warmth completely morphed into a literal theater of war. Just listen to the quote on screen from the BBC's Archie Macpherson. He compared it to a scene out of Apocalypse Now or past Shendale, and he hit the nail on the head. Viewers at home were just watching an absolute horror as the 95th Scottish Cup final disintegrated into one of the most violent spectacles in British sports history.
And what made it so incredibly violent? Well, the weapons of the Hampden Riot were terrifyingly everyday items. Fans had brought staggering quantities of glass bottles and heavy metal cans straight into the ground. When the riot kicked off, these were instantly turned into improvised missiles. People were literally tearing down the stadium's fences to use as clubs. Meanwhile, the police? They were mostly caught outside preparing for the post-match exit, so they were hopelessly outnumbered. They faced this terrifying barrage, which actually forced mounted police units to desperately charge right into the melee, just to grab back some basic semblance of control.
So, let's look at Section 1, a pressure cooker erupts. To really understand this explosion, we first have to understand the immense pressure cooker of that specific match. The old firm rivalry, the historic, massive clash between Celtic and Rangers, was already a powder keg. For years, it had been a cornerstone of Scottish identity, but it was heavily driven by deep sectarian divides, intense tribalism, and, crucial to our story, a massive culture of heavy drinking. Plus, the stakes for this 1980 match were just enormous. It was literally the very last chance for either of these Glasgow giants to salvage a season that had been totally dominated by Alex Ferguson's Aberdeen.
In the match itself, it really didn't offer any release valve for all that nervous energy. It was this dour, attritional slog that stayed completely goalless after 90 long minutes. The tension was just building and building. Finally, in extra time, George McCluskey steered a Danny McGrain shot into the net for Celtic. That goal was the crack in the dam. When the final whistle finally blew to seal a 1-0 Celtic victory, elated fans, who were emboldened by the total lack of perimeter control we talked about earlier, just spilled right out onto the grass to celebrate with their team.
Now, the crucial point here is how this exact moment fractured depending on who you asked. For the Celtic fans, it started out simply as a spontaneous expression of pure joy. But those celebrations turned into a riot almost instantly when, reportedly, a Celtic supporter ran all the way over to the Rangers' end and kicked a ball into the goal. For the thousands of rival Rangers fans still sitting in their seats, dealing with the bitter sting of defeat, well, this was seen as an absolutely intolerable provocation. That was the spark. It sent thousands of supporters from both sides pouring onto the pitch, clashing in these massive, chaotic waves of violence.
This brings us to Section 2, the swift legislative crackdown.
The immediate aftermath was just a period of intense national shame, and this is where our explainer shifts from a sports story straight into the halls of Parliament. The whole nation had just watched a football match turn into a battlefield on live TV, and the government felt they had to act right then and there. I mean, the dust hadn't even settled before politicians and the press were pointing the finger at one undeniable spark: the stadium's drinking culture and the totally unchecked consumption of alcohol. The sheer volume of bottles and cans used as weapons made it impossible to ignore. George Younger, the Secretary of State for Scotland at the time, was forced to step up and address Parliament about the massive public outcry.
And the government's reaction? Breathtakingly fast. Seriously, by August of 1980, just 3 short months after the riot, the Criminal Justice Scotland Act was passed. Colloquially known as the booze ban, this was a swift, highly blunt legal instrument. It completely banned the sale of alcohol within Scottish sports grounds. It was designed specifically to sober up a society that lawmakers felt had, frankly, completely lost its grip on decorum.
Which leads us into Section 3, a lasting cultural legacy.
You see, this legislation didn't just end a football season. No, it forced a systemic reckoning that permanently altered the entire landscape of Scottish sports fandom. It essentially forced society to look hard at the deep-seated issues of sectarianism and alcohol abuse that had been ignored for way too long. And for nearly half a century, we're talking almost 50 years here, this terrace prohibition has remained an immovable fixture of the game. It's a direct, enduring consequence of that one afternoon on May 10th, 1980.
Entire generations of football fans in Scotland have grown up completely under the shadow of this single piece of reactionary legislation.
Now, while the modern era has introduced a few slight softenings, like, say, allowing alcohol for corporate hospitality guests and making very specific exceptions for international rugby at venues like Murrayfield, the core prohibition remains firmly intact. The strict ban on general football terrace alcohol sales endures to this very day. It literally draws a direct, unbroken line from the 1980 Scottish Cup final straight to the modern fan experience.
So, it really brings us to a fascinating final thought. How many of our modern laws are simply the enduring ghosts of a single afternoon that just got way out of control? The riot of 1980 marked the definitive end of an era. Every single time a fan walks into a Scottish stadium today, they are stepping into a reality completely forged by the fallout of the Hampden Riot. It really leaves you wondering, what other rules governing our daily lives are just echoes of past chaos, put in place simply because the law could never forget,